Welcome to yet another video. In this 6th episode of the story, Naruto gets a gift that is thought to be legendary even in a world where some people walk on water every day. Will the gift lead him to peace, or will the effects of the gift leave a hole in his heart that is too big to fill? Please support us by liking and subscribing. Let's get started now. So where are we now? Shizuku looked over at her companion, noting that he seemed just as tired as she did. Once they had made their swift escape from Taki, they had been pretty much running non-stop east towards the country's border. Naruto was just glad he had completed his wind training before they were forced to flee as they passed by more than a few waterfalls on their tactical retreat. It's not far now. According to the map and that large valley we just passed through, Ta-no Kuni should only be another mile or so. Shizuku just nodded between ragged breaths, slightly surprising herself at how she took the news. Before Naruto came into her life, even a single mile might have sounded daunting, but now she could use chakra. It wasn't all that far. Sometimes what she could now do still amazed the girl. Everything was so different after you began using chakra. Running was easier, weights were less heavy, and you had more energy than ever. It was just indescribable. Alright, but promise we'll stop after we pass the border. All she got was a fairly non-committal nod from the blonde. She knew it was still dangerous to stop so soon, but she was nearly exhausted. Naruto probably wouldn't admit it, but even he was a little winded from the run. Despite his large reserves and incredible stamina, he was still fallible. Are they following? Naruto quickly turned, not breaking his stride as he ran backwards for a few meters, allowing his Rinnegan eyes to scan the forest behind them. He quickly turned back before he could accidentally run into anything and subtly altered their course slightly. I don't see anybody, but that doesn't mean they aren't following. Shizuku just nodded tiredly as she forced her legs to keep going, maintaining a steady flow of chakra to her muscles as best she could. She wouldn't be surprised if they had pursuers. Their escape from Taki had hardly been as subtle as either of them could have hoped for. Come on, we need to get to the tunnels as quickly as possible. Shizuku nodded determinedly as the two set off at a reasonably quick but not suspiciously fast pace through the winding streets. They mostly stuck to the quieter back alleys to avoid running into any prying eyes. Unfortunately, that didn't work for long. Oi, you two! Naruto froze, an irritated expression quickly suppressed behind a serene and innocent smile. He turned only to see the same large shaven-headed who had accompanied Fu, as well as the one who had administered her punishments. Even seeing him made Naruto's head clench slightly before he realized what he was doing and forced himself to relax. Can we help you, Shinobi-san? The man only leveled a suspicious gaze on the two, particularly Naruto, who he narrowed his eyes at dangerously. I need to take you two in for questioning regarding one of our shinobi who have gone missing. The man seemed to struggle with the word shinobi, which didn't do much to settle Naruto's growing temper. He hadn't been the only one to share their story. Fu had told him enough about her treatment that he had begun to seriously reconsider his beliefs in the one instance. And how would we be of any help? The man just grunted as he made a move to grab Naruto's wrist, the monk quickly leaning back to avoid him. That doesn't matter, you are in our village, you have to follow our rules. If we demand you come in for questioning, you either do or I question you right now. Naruto's smile widened, although it was incredibly strained. Luckily he had been hiding behind masks of happiness almost his entire life, so the burly shinobi noticed nothing. I'm afraid that would be incredibly inconvenient right now, Shinobi-san. Like the man before, Naruto was beginning to have difficulty saying the honorific with any kind of sincerity. You see, my friend and I were running an urgent errand. Would it be possible for us to reschedule? The man finally seemed to lose his patience as in one swift move he grabbed Shizuku by the wrist. No, now are you going to come with me or are you going to make this difficult? As if to emphasize his point, he had withdrawn a kunai and was now holding it far too close to Shizuku's side for Naruto's comfort. Please let my friend go, Shinobi-san, I assure you this will not end well otherwise. All the mirth and warmth in Naruto's voice had disappeared, although his smile eerily remained on his face, giving him a rather sinister air the Takinin seemed blissfully unaware of. Is that some kind of threat, boy? Three things suddenly all happened at once. Shizuku elbowed the man in the gut in a moment of hesitation. Naruto subtly pulled the kunai out of his hands with a silent banzai tenin as he stepped forward, swinging his staff low to take the man's feet out from under him. The end result was the larger man on his back against the wet ground as Naruto stood over him, cast into darkness by the sun behind him. No, it was not. With that, the boy's hand suddenly lashed out too fast for the much larger and slower shinobi to react. Before he knew it, something was tightly secured around his neck as the blonde stepped back. I would suggest you avoid trying to use chakra, it won't be pleasant if you do. And with that, the boy swiftly turned on a heel, cloak billowing around him, and strode off, Shizuku not far behind. The man got to his feet in anger, noting he didn't actually have any injuries as he quickly began forming hand signs to blast the kid in the back with a jutsu. Naruto just sighed as he walked, his face suddenly appearing much older than it should. As he turned the corner, he ignored the sudden cries of the large man as a huge burst of electricity ran through his body from the sealed collar around his neck. After that, the two had less difficulty. It turned out during a lockdown the tunnels were actually not that well guarded. Taki didn't have a large shinobi force, so during situations like these they were stretched rather thin. Naruto only had to subtly drain two standing guards of their chakra, not even having to get close, instead just shifting the ground beneath them into chakra-laced sand he could use his Preta path through. After that, it was only a matter of remembering the way out through the labyrinthian tunnel system, which proved no challenge. Of course, it was still a shinobi village. No doubt the guards were found rather quickly, alerting the rest to the fact people had most likely escaped. Naruto didn't want to place his faith in the Taki shinobi's belief that their tunnel system was infallible. So they had ran off as fast as they could east, helpfully in the direction of Kaminari no Kuni, but more immediately by Tani no Kuni's neighbor Ta no Kuni. As they dashed through a large clearing at the base of a valley, mere blurs to civilian eyes, Naruto paused, Shizuku following his lead a moment later. She looked at him in confusion as he just stood there, wondering why they were wasting precious second that the ninja could catch up to them in. Naruto just smiled though as he turned slightly to the side. Shizuku followed his gaze and was a little shocked to see Fu standing up in a tree, looking down at them uncertainly. "It's good to see you so soon, Fu." The green-haired kunoichi didn't respond, just dropping out of her tree and walking over to them slowly. "I expected you would be further away from here by now with those wings." The verdette seemed to struggle with something for a moment before sighing as she neared them. "I had to get something first." For the first time, Shizuku noticed Fu now sported a very large red container on her back, held on by red straps crossing over her chest. The purple-haired girl suddenly became very self-conscious when she noticed the straps accentuated Fu's developing bust. "Using that chakra is too tiring for long flights. I had to land and she looked down, surprising both Naruto and Shizuku with her bashful appearance. "I saw you running and," once again the girl seemed to overcome her momentary shyness, tapping into her emotional training. Not that she was ever grateful for anything done to her in Taki, but she was at least able to acknowledge its use. She straightened up, her face losing the ever so slight blush that had formed. "I would like to travel with you." She looked away suddenly, the confidence boost only lasting momentarily. Luckily she didn't revert to some stuttering mess and the blush seemed gone for good. "At least for a short time anyway. I don't know much about the world except for some information on other hidden villages." The silence was nearly deafening as Naruto seemed to calmly take Fu in with his gaze while Shizuku's nervously flit between them with a hint of curiosity. As the seconds ticked by, Fu's resolve slowly began to crumble as she started to think asking them was a bad idea. Of course they wouldn't want her traveling with them. She was no use, only a burden who knew less about surviving in the world than a child. Finally, at the moment she just planned on turning away, Naruto let out a grin as he inclined his head slightly. "I would be happy for you to come with us, of course." His smile brightened as a new sparkle of hope appeared in Fu's orange eyes. "Right, Shizuku?" At suddenly being included in the conversation, the violet nearly eeped in surprise before vigorously nodding with her own bright smile. "Yeah." Naruto chuckled at that as he turned back to the now uncertain Fu. she had been hopeful when she thought about asking them, but a large part of her still believed there was no way they would allow her to go with them. But we might want to get a move on. Naruto looked back the way they came, spotting a few approaching chakra signatures that were steadily growing stronger. If you really want to come fu, then you have to keep up. With that, Naruto offered a slightly cheeky grin before dashing off into the trees, shortly followed by Shizuku as she gave Fu a friendly beckoning motion. Fu just stood there, shell-shocked as she looked in the direction they had gone, before a tiny smile twitched at the edge of her lips for a brief second. She immediately sprinted off after them, and not 5 seconds later a small group of Taki shinobi landed in the clearing. Where did it go? One of the members in particular looked down at the ground for a moment, analytical eyes studying the way the soil had been recently disturbed. He nodded once before silently motioning to the others as they once again to pursuit. Shizuku was now panting rather heavily as they bounded through tree branches. They had crossed over the border 40 minutes earlier, but the pursuing ninja continued to follow them. Obviously they believed retrieval of their weapon was worth the risk of angering Tano Kuni. It wasn't a hard decision. With no ninja village of its own and no solid alliances with other nations, the land of rice paddies really posed no threat to the more established land of valleys. Unfortunately, to the group of 3 or 4 with Masaru, that meant they didn't have the luxury of a break. Luckily Fu and Naruto weren't too badly affected, both having large reserves and exceptional stamina. They were still going fairly strong. The same could not be said for Shizuku. Naruto was doing what he could by topping up her chakra every so often, but there was only so much strain on her muscles and lungs that more chakra could help with. Both Jinchuriki had noticed this, but it was Fu who spoke up first. "We need to stop." Naruto nodded sadly as they continued to sprint. He had been thinking about this too and knew their choices weren't all that open. "If we stop, we will have to face those ninja." Fu just blinked once, her deadpan expression not changing for a moment. "Fine." Naruto sighed into his hand at that. He knew traveling with somebody like Fu was certainly going to be an experience, to say the least. The 3 came to a stop in the next clearing they passed through, Shizuku taking the opportunity to lean against a tree and catch her breath. Not seconds later the ninja following them appeared, not entirely looking fresh themselves after such a long run. "Good, you realized running from us is futile." Naruto just smiled passively as he walked in between the two groups, not looking all that threatening with his kindly smile and monk robes. Even so, Shizuku knew when he was readying herself to fight, absently drumming his fingers on his shikuju with his sujigasa pulled back so the string wrapped around his neck and the hat itself rested against his upper back. "I do not wish to fight you, Shinobi-san. If you and your fellow ninja leave now, this can all end peacefully." The lead ninja sneered behind his face mask, already motioning for the other ninja around him to fall into formation. "The only way this is ending is with the demon back in Taki where it belongs. Stand in our way and you'll only get yourself killed." Some of the younger shinobi were slightly unnerved when Naruto just looked up, still smiling but lacking the mirth from before. Most shinobi had an inherent sense for danger, and right now that was rolling off this 11-year-old in spades. "Well, I was looking for an opportunity to try this out anyway." With that, Naruto planted his shikuju into the ground, pulling off his traveling cloak in one sweeping movement and placing it on the staff like a coat rack. "Last chance, kid, let us take the weapon without a fight and you'll probably only end up in a cell for the rest of your miserable life." Naruto's smile only twisted up more at the edges as his hair fell forward over his eyes. "I would appreciate if you didn't call my friend a weapon." His arm began to tremble at his side, but not from any kind of anger or fury, just the sheer volume of chakra he was pushing through it. He raised it up slowly, making sure he was looking right at the ninja before opening his eyes, releasing the chakra as he clenched his fist tightly. Kenkiona Jinbun. It was almost instantaneous. All of the shinobi in front of them gasped before buckling to one knee, each feeling like they were carrying an elephant on their back. They could only watch as Naruto increased the pressure in his hand, the weight pressing down on them increasing with it. What they didn't know was that Naruto had raised the gravitational pull in the area underneath them. Currently they were facing 6 times the Earth's normal gravity. Sometimes ninja use special seals to simulate increased gravity for resistance training, however to have that happen so suddenly and to such a degree, it was astounding they hadn't passed out yet from the blood rushing away from their heads. As if thinking would bring it about, one of the ninja's eyes rolled back in his head before slumping to the floor completely. It was like a chain reaction and soon all of the ninja were lying on the ground, completely unconscious. Immediately Naruto opened his hand, allowing the gravity to return to normal, tolerable levels as he took a deep breath. He had never tried that technique on another living being before, only having plants to try it on. It took a lot out of him. He turned with a smile at his two astounded and amazed companions. Shizuku's jaw was even hanging open. Suddenly though that look of awe twisted into shock and fear, and out of the corner of his eye Naruto saw something flying at him. His head turned, but it was too late to dodge. He could clearly see every centimeter of the kunai flying right for his eyes, only a meter away. One of the Taki ninja had only played dead, launching a kunai as soon as the blonde back was turned. Naruto could literally only watch in horror as the cold metal weapon came closer to his head. There wasn't even enough time to use Shinra Tensei. However, as soon as Naruto closed his eyes, a metallic clang sounded out around the small clearing. When Naruto felt no pain, he wearily cracked open an eye only to stare incredulously. In his hand was a long, thin black rod that was cold and heavy like metal. It had defiantly not been in his hand before. It was like his body had moved on pure instinct. As soon as the cool metal appeared in his hand, he had brought it up in a millisecond to deflect the kunai where it now stuck point down in the ground. The Taki ninja who threw it saw it fail, cursing as his eyelids finally closed, succumbing to the unconsciousness he had staved off. Naruto just continued to stare in shock at the thin metal rod that had appeared in his hand, seemingly out of thin air. At that point Shizuku ran over, fussing over the blonde in concern. However, when she saw there were no injuries, she backed off with a relieved smile. After she did, Fu walked over slightly shyly. If Naruto hadn't been occupied with shock over still having eyes, he might have found her slight rosy blush cute. "Why did you defend me like that?" Naruto finally shook his head, dropping the pole by accident as he cleared his head of the shock. To everybody's amazement, as soon as it touched the ground it seemed to dissipate into a fine black dust before completely vanishing. After that particular shock wore off, the blonde looked up at Fu, managing to get a smile back on his face. "You're my friend, Fu. I'll never need a reason to protect you or anybody else precious to me." He looked back down at where the black rod had disappeared, so missed when Fu's eyes widened and a new blush spread over her nose. Something like this was very new to her. Human interaction beyond violence was well out of her comfort zone. All she had to go on were the few observations she could make walking to and from her cell back in Taki. This was why she took a step forward, awkwardly placed her arms around the blonde Jinchuriki and stood there for a moment, all without properly understanding why. Finally, after Shizuku coughed from the awkward situation, Fu stepped back, returning her face to its previous emotionless mask. However, she couldn't fight back the small blush still staining her caramel skin, much to her joint ire and confusion. Naruto just looked at her for a moment, mild surprise and amusement mixing across his face before he settled for a small nod. Finally feeling a little better, Fu finally asked the question burning at the back of her mind. "Those abilities you displayed, was that some form of wind manipulation?" She was curious, as if it was then she hoped to be able to learn it. It appeared to be an excellent wide-area submission technique. Naruto just chuckled as he looked at the unconscious ninja, still spread out at awkward angles on the floor. "Actually no, it's more akin to gravity manipulation." Fu blinked at that in surprise. She had never heard of such an ability and she was forced to be up to date with any and all possible threats to the village. "Is that some form of Kekkai Genkai?" Naruto just grinned again anxiously, wondering how much to say here before deciding against having any secrets with a fellow Jinchuriki. He opened his eyes fully, eliciting a small look of interest from Fu as she peered into the steely purple orbs. "Not exactly, more one aspect out of 6. At that, Fu raised an eyebrow, all kinds of modesty and social convention abandoned in favor of curiosity. She leaned in closer, studying the rings in his eyes, making Naruto rather embarrassed at having her so close to his face. From here he could see her skin was incredibly smooth, not a single blemish across her face, and almost chuckled at the way her lips pursed in her concentration. I have never heard or seen of this jujitsu. Naruto smiled brightly as he backed away, earning a cute, if unintentional pout from the other Jinchuriki. I'm not surprised really, we can talk more about it later though. He motioned over to where the ninja still lay with a thumb. We need to find somewhere safe to hide out for the night in case any more of them show up. Fu just nodded, obviously eager to do just that so she could get her answers. She crouched on the ground and Naruto could immediately see her channel her Bijuu's chakra in a minute amount, directing it into the ground. After a minute of waiting she stood back up, her face having returned to its emotionless state with the chance to get her thoughts in order. There is a small underground structure about half a mile from here. She looked around a moment before seemingly pointing in random direction. That way. Naruto just looked at her curiously, wondering how she could detect such a thing from such a distance. Was that some kind of earth jutsu? Fu just shook her head, already setting off for the supposed complex, too eager to wait. The mint-haired girl just looked back around, the corners of her lips twitching slightly. We can talk more about it later. With that she darted into the trees, leaving a dumbfounded Naruto and Shizuku in her wake. The blonde just turned to the girl, still looking surprised. Did she just make a joke? Shizuku just shrugged, looking equally confused. I guess she's adjusting quickly. The two could only shake their heads as they darted off after the Nanabi Jinchuriki. Well, this doesn't look at all ominous. The sarcasm in Shizuku's voice was almost palpable as the trio stared at the imposing sight before them. In the middle of the forest, where you would least expect it to be, was a staircase of rough-hewn stone. However, this was not the first time Naruto and Shizuku had encountered a staircase where it probably shouldn't have been. It still made them more wary of the whole situation though, they didn't need a repeat of what happened in Kusa. You're sure this place is empty? Fu just gave a curt nod, looking more like she was giving a report to superiors than a reassuring gesture to a friend. Shizuku was confused for a moment when she tried to imagine why it wouldn't be that way. The staircase itself was surrounded on both sides by a small stone structure, just to better distinguish it from the surrounding forest. However, most unnervingly there seemed to be various snake decals drawn into the walls at random. Maybe we would feel more secure if you told us just how you know. Fu looked over at Naruto for a moment, back to the staircase and then back to the blonde. The Nanabi gives me a somewhat limited ability to communicate with certain insect species. I simply asked them if there was anywhere nearby and they pointed me here. According to the chakra-sensitive species, there are no presences inside the complex larger than common mice. Naruto nodded with a smile as he noticed Shizuku calm down slightly. Still, Mid-Era had been able to hide his chakra signature from Naruto, so he wanted to be cautious nonetheless. Alright then, good enough for me. With that the blonde descended into the stairwell, rather pleasantly surprised when a light came on above his head, activated by his proximity. Oh good, I won't have to light the way this time. He continued on down with a rhythmic tapping as his shikuju connected with every alternate step. Fu was about to follow him when she noticed Shizuku's continued hesitancy. She had seen the same thing with some shinobi when on missions and thought she knew the proper course of action. I would not worry, Shizuku-san, if there are people down there then they are most definitely dead. At most we will find a few skeletons or perhaps a corpse, so there is no need to worry. With that she patted the violet on the shoulder and descended into the staircase herself. Shizuku just stared after her as her shoulders slumped forward dejectedly. Great. After a little while of searching the underground complex and not finding much of interest other than a few scraps of what looked like burnt paper, the trio settled down in a large room. It was filled with many standard beds that weren't too comfortable but better than sleeping on the floor. To Fu though they felt like a luxury item, the fact she actually sank into the mattress kept amazing her like a cat following a light on the wall. It was almost amusing to watch her repeatedly sit or jump on the bed, almost. After all, it only brought Naruto to think about why she could find such enjoyment in it in the first place. After they were settled in for the night, Naruto had gone on to explain about his Rinnegan to Fu. The girl had listened at an almost unnaturally rapt attention with wide eyes, just soaking in the information like a sponge. Naruto believed it was because of her isolated life. She would naturally want to do the things that were either considered forbidden for her to do before or would feel like a large middle finger to Taki. Considering how much they kept her in the dark about, either intentionally or just out of apathy, it was no wonder she had such an intense thirst for knowledge. It was perhaps for the wrong reasons, but you work with what you have. At the end of their talk, Fu sat quietly for a moment, digesting what she had heard as Shizuku played with Masaru on the other side of the room. Naruto had made a small fire for them by burning some old wooden furniture they had found. Luckily the complex had a ventilation system. Perhaps this new ability of your involving the chakra rod is connected to your Kekkai Genkai. Naruto blinked, wondering why that of all things was the first subject Fu brought up. I suppose it could be, but I don't feel any kind of words coming to mind when I think about it. Naruto had not been idle as they talked. He had attempted to recreate the rod again with some success. He had plenty of experience recreating abilities from only one experience. By now he knew it had something to do with necessity, like if he needed the ability to create a rod of black metal to deflect a kunai and that was in the capabilities of the Rinnegan, then it would happen. So right now he was twirling such a rod absently in his hands. Now that he had the chance to better look at it, he could see it was practically flooded with chakra. In fact, if Naruto hadn't seen it up close and actually touched it, he could have sworn it was just pure chakra in a cylinder shape. The only conclusion Naruto had at the moment was it was actually created from his own chakra. Fu supported this. She had knowledge of a few clans and Kekkai Genkai with the limited ability to create solid constructs from chakra. In fact, one of the clans native to Ta no Kuni, the Fuma, had a few members who specialized in it. After a whole, though their conversation wound down as it grew later, they had all had a stressful and exhausting day and needed some rest. It was with no small amount of satisfaction Naruto laid his head down on the plain mattress, almost immediately falling asleep. It wasn't to last, it seemed, as after what felt like only minutes, but based on his internal clock probably closer to an hour, Naruto shifted awake. He sleepily raised his head with a frown. He was normally an excellent sleeper, if not slightly alert in the morning to threats. It just came with sleeping outside, even with the protection of his sand huts. He soon realized why he had woken up when he turned, somewhat surprised to see Fu in her own bed, sitting there and just staring off into space. Fu? The mint-haired girl turned quickly before relaxing at the sight of the blonde looking over at her in concern. I apologize, Naruto-san, I did not mean to wake you. Naruto quickly waved her off as he stood up, stretching off his back slightly from the stiff bed. Call me Naruto, I don't like all that honorific stuff. I never feel like I deserve the respect. Fu just blinked at him in surprise. In her eyes he was the one who rescued her from a life of misery. If she couldn't respect him, then she did think she could respect anybody. Why are you still up? Fu just blinked again as she looked towards the door of the room where a hint of moonlight trickled through the corridor. It is not my designated sleeping time yet. Naruto gave a worried frown as he walked over, leaning against the bed opposite his fellow Jinchuriki. What do you mean? Fu just looked up at him like what she had said made perfect sense. I am supposed to go to sleep at exactly midnight to wake up at precisely 4 in order to maximize productivity. Naruto just sighed with a small but sad smile. Fu, you're not in Taki anymore. You're allowed to go to sleep whenever you like. Fu just gave a small frown of her own as she looked down at the bed. She didn't feel sleepy yet, she was too used to her schedule. I don't think I can. Naruto just gave her a grin as he offered out his hand. Alright then, why don't we go for a walk then? Fu just blinked at the outstretched hand before taking it hesitantly. The two slowly began to stroll through the seemingly abandoned complex in silence. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of a cicada. Finally Naruto broke it as they turned a bend, absently trailing a hand across the wall. So what do you think this place was? Fu looked around for a moment, noting the corridor was well constructed, although it looked to be slightly hurried. The walls were wooden but well maintained and free of rot, while the floor was stone slabs. Perhaps some kind of smuggling outpost. There were fairly common missions back in Taki to eliminate them. Naruto just nodded with a thoughtful look, at least until his hand trailed over a particular panel in the wall, applying just enough pressure for it to move in slightly. The two immediately stepped back as a stone slab in front of them swung away to reveal a set of hidden stairs beneath them. There was silence for a moment as both peered into the darkness below them for a moment. Did any of those smuggling hideouts have one of these? Fu just stared down for a little longer, slightly unnerved by the lack of bugs she could feel down there. No, they did not. Is it just me, or is it getting warmer down here? The two were making their way down the winding staircase they found. It may not have been the smartest thing they had ever done, however, no matter what their lives had been like, they were still prepubescent kids and their curiosity won out. Fu just looked around as the earthen walls were slowly replaced by metal as the staircase continued to spiral down. It is. Most likely this area of the compound is either heated or lacks ventilation to prevent exposure or infiltration. It is fairly common practice when creating a forward base in enemy territory. Naruto just sighed as he refrained from trailing his arms along the walls again, wary from what happened last time. Great, so we managed to stumble across another secret base. Fu looked at him curiously for a moment as the blonde chuckled anxiously. Long story, but we accidentally found an underground base in Kusa no Kuni. Turned out this guy was guarding it who could turn his body into mud, kept saying stuff about protecting the base and Orochimaru-sama. I beat him and we left, didn't really feel like sticking around after he almost killed Shizuku. Fu just looked even more intrigued as she returned her gaze straight ahead. You're sure he said Orochimaru? Naruto just nodded while Fu's gaze turned thoughtful, like she was remembering something and trying to get the details right. Orochimaru, S-ranked Nukenin from Konohagakure no Sato, previous member of the Densetsu no Sannin and holder of the snake summoning contract, do not approach. Naruto blinked in surprise as the stairway finally leveled out, turning into a long metallic corridor with only 2 rooms on either side. That was very comprehensive. Fu just nodded succinctly as she made her way over to the left-hand door. I was encouraged to memorize the bingo book for reference on missions. Naruto could quite easily hear the spite in her voice as she spoke. Wait. He quickly grabbed Fu's hand before she could lay it on the door. There are seals covering the door. I'm not sure what they do, but I don't think they're going to make us feel good. Fu just blinked calmly before retracting her hand, allowing Naruto instead to reach forward and drain the chakra from the seals. Wow, they really put a lot of chakra in these. They really didn't want anybody getting in here. Eventually he stopped, now satisfied the door was completely harmless. Even so, when he went to open it he found it was locked. As if that'll keep me out. Banzhou Tenin. Almost immediately the door began to crumple, buckling out as if struck by some enormous force on the other side. Fu was actually surprised it was still holding with so much apparent strain on the metal. Eventually though, the sturdy door was completely ripped from its hinges, forcing Naruto to dodge to one side in order to avoid it crushing him against the other side of the corridor. He grinned, rubbing his hands together expectantly as he walked inside, only to frown. What the? It's just a load of drawers. Sure enough, the room was completely lined with drawers, ranging from old wooden ones to more modern metal filing cabinets. There were even a few desks in the corners with various papers strewn across their surfaces. You should not be so quick to dismiss. If the information here was guarded so thoroughly, it is sure to be valuable, at least to somebody. She idly moved to one of the desks, picking up a loose sheet from one of the many stacks. It was mostly incomprehensible to her, but she could at least glean it was some kind of blueprint, to what she couldn't say though. Naruto likewise began looking at the various drawers, now noticing many were labeled with names of either places or people. Most prevalent were the Shinobi villages, and not just the main ones. There were places like Hoshigakure and Tanigakure among others. Oh hey, this one's got the name of that guy we faced in Kusa that I was telling you about. Interested, Fu grabbed the manila file with the name, Mid-Era, printed in the upper right corner. She flicked through the contents which were, once again, mostly lost on her being scientific jargon. However, one sheet caught her eye in particular which she drew out to read under better light. Subject 17 shows incredible promise adapting to the splicing treatment. Chakra paper tests prove an unimaginable affinity for Earth which was previously non-existent. Full range of abilities unknown. Recommend observation in isolated base until further testing authorized. Results of test to be used in treatments classified Nidame, H2, and Sora, U7. She looked up to see Naruto's confused face which unknowingly mirrored her own. What does all that mean? Fu shrugged absently as she continued to flick through the file, growing more and more disgusted as she went. It appeared somebody was forcibly attempting to create affinities in somebody by using gene splicing techniques. Based on the fact this is subject 17 and the first one to show positive result, I would say the treatments are not that effective. Naruto felt a little queasy at that. He had seen Mid-Era firsthand. The treatment had been very successful from his perspective. Fu quickly set the file down and began scanning the files again until she found the one labeled Nidame, H2. Naruto, I believe you should read this one. It appears they repeated the procedure but with cells from the Nidame Hokage and a member of the Hozuki clan. From that alone it is obvious they were attempting to create the perfect water affinity and well, read for yourself. Naruto did, carefully flicking between the various pages filled with detailed medical reports, test notes as well as a list and profiles of all the subjects, which happened to be unfortunately lengthy. Finally he put it down, his hand on his chin as he frowned deeply at the floor. And you think, he left it hanging but got a quick nod from Fu who didn't seem quite as disturbed as he did. Then again he wondered if she actually saw the wrong in these experiments in the first place. It is quite possible, the listed attributes the various subjects displayed is eerily similar. Naruto nodded grimly. What Fu said was completely true, down to the T. But this said there were no survivors. Fu just shrugged, idly flicking through another report but not finding much more of interest. It's quite possible reports can be falsified or missing. Naruto just sighed into his hand, fingering the file anxiously and wishing the room was large enough to pace in. Should we tell her? Fu just gave Naruto a deadpan look, causing the boy to give another drawn-out sigh. Right, not so good on the people skills. Fu just looked down for a moment only for Naruto to give her a reassuring pat on the back. It's alright, we'll sleep on it for now. With that he grabbed the file and sealed it into one of his pouches before quickly walking out of the room. Fu followed but gave a curious glance back at the room. We are just going to leave it like this? Naruto smirked quietly as his eyes took on a dangerous edge, looking rather ominous as they glowed. Oh no, these experiments are sick. I'm destroying any trace of them, and if I ever find the man who was responsible for all this. He left that statement hanging, but Fu could easily feel the sheer anger in his words, despite them being rather cold and even. There'll be nothing left when I'm through. He turned back to the room and began channeling his chakra through his hands rapidly, faster and faster until it began to heat up and convert into fire-natured chakra. Fu could only watch in a great deal of amazement as Naruto's hands burst into bright orange flame, yet his hands seemed completely unharmed. He quickly went about the room, burning away any and all files he found until there was nothing left in the room but fire and ash. He finally emerged looking a great deal calmer as he allowed the flames in his hands to snuff out. He breathed out a sigh of relief before smiling at the now befuddled Jinchuriki, waving his hands to cool them off slightly. Well, I feel better. Luckily the other room on the secret floor was just some kind of operating room with a single raised table and a few shelves with nothing in. Satisfied that whoever owned this place would be severely irritated when they came back to it, Naruto and Fu made their way back up to the main floor of the base, sealing the passage behind them. Before the two went to bed though, Naruto caught Fu by the wrist softly, unknowingly making the girl blush slightly. For now, let's not tell Shizuku about this, it would be a lot to take in. Fu blinked in confusion for a moment before nodding once, earning a smile of appreciation from Naruto. I promise I will tell her, but somewhere better than here. Fu just nodded again. She had already made her peace and didn't need the reassurance, but she still found it quite nice. Good night, Naruto-san. The blonde just gave a tired sigh as he moved over to his own bed. I told you, Naruto is fine. The next day the trio set out from the base quite happily, eager to get away from there, especially Shizuku. Naruto had woken early, or at least he thought he had. Fu in fact had been up for several hours before him. He had actually been worried at first as he had woken up only to find Fu not in her bed. Luckily he found her quite close to the entrance of the base, just sitting on a rock and waiting for the sun to rise. According to her, she had never had the time to really appreciate it before. It had only indicated a time for her to begin changing exercises. Naruto was rather pleased with the contented expression on Fu's face as they walked. It appeared an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Where before her movements had been stiff and anxious, she now had a much lighter step and a more calm face without it having to be forced. He made a silent promise to himself that, like with Shizuku, he would never allow something to hurt Fu as long as he could protect her. She deserved that at least. Crossing through Tano Kuni proved uneventful save for a few attempts at pickpocketing the trio while passing through less than reputable towns. Luckily most of what they owned that was precious was sealed within Naruto's pouches, including their money and supplies, and any attempt to even touch the container on Fu's back ended up with the thief on the floor, more often than not sporting a newly broken wrist. It was confusing the blonde as from what he had been told by his master, the land of rice paddies was supposed to be a small but still economically sound country. It made sense considering they grew and provided the bulk of rice to the elemental nations, less domestic-oriented countries like Kaminari no Kuni and Kaze no Kuni being nearly dependent on their crop. However, from what he could see, the people seemed run down or drained, and many had taken to thievery to just stay afloat. He had helped where he could, but a lot of the time he could see his generosity was being greatly taken advantage of. As soon as he handed out even a little bit of food to the people, he would immediately be swamped by what felt like the entire village. It was here that Naruto aptly learned that if you give a man a fish he eats for a day, give a man a fishing rod and he will sell it to buy fish anyway. He had also had an impromptu lesson on politics when he passed through a village that was struggling with their crop. He had gouged out a large trench from a nearby river with his gravity manipulation so their crops could be irrigated, only to have a multitude of mercenaries set on him by a local feudal lord that was rather displeased his water feature had stopped working. When he had found out exactly why he and his companions had been chased across half the country, he had nearly turned around to level the lord's house. By the time they finally reached the border to Uno Kuni, they were tired, hot and sticky, as well as very low on money and supplies. It was almost with audible relief the trio finally stopped at a local village. Naruto could practically smell the hot springs from the gate. They checked into a small onsen inn with what little money they had left before exhaustedly collapsing on their beds. They only had enough money for a single two-person room though, so in Naruto's case he exhaustedly collapsed on the small couch. Naruto wearily blinked his eyes open, rather surprised when he found himself not in the room he had collapsed in, but inside his seal instead. The usual greeting occurred of Shikaku excitedly bouncing around, Kyubi belittling him, Shikaku flying into a rage before quieting down as he once again noticed the blonde. Naruto had taken the opportunity to try something by creating one of his black chakra rods, just confirming that he could do that within the seal. Technically he could produce anything in the seal, but the rod was still flooded with his chakra. He looked up only to strangely find Shikaku's gaze firmly fixed on the rod in his hands. Slowly Naruto moved it across, watching as Shikaku's golden orbs followed it with almost palpable anticipation. Once again he slowly moved it across his body, and once again the eyes followed its movements. A devious grin spread across the boy's face as he suddenly pulled his arm back and threw the rod as hard as he could into the Ichibi's cell, firing it forward with gravity manipulation for good measure. As expected but still highly amusing, Shikaku lurched back as his head tracked the rod's flight path before suddenly scrambling backward to run after it. The great sand construct's slow lumbering steps faded off into the distance of his darkened cell. At that point the Kyubi lazily rolled its eye in Naruto's direction. its furry brow darkening for a moment as it watched Naruto swiftly slide another rod out of his sleeve. "If you throw that rod at me, I swear I will rip off the arm you used to throw it with great satisfaction." Naruto just grinned sheepishly as he allowed the rod to dissipate into a harmless dust. "Hey!" The enormous fox just sighed deeply, the great breath of air causing Naruto's robes to billow out. "For what tortuous reason are you visiting me today, bearing that bastardized technique of the sage with you no less?" Naruto just blinked as he created another rod, staring down at it curiously as he turned it about in his hands. "This is one of the sage's techniques?" Again the great fox snorted derisively, its red orbs narrowing in contempt. "Please, to compare your cheap conjuring trick with the sage's Banbatsu Suzu is the same as comparing a dying ember to the sun," the fox made to get close to the bars to increase his intimidating glare. "You will never be him." Naruto simply grinned right back, disturbing the chakra creature with how dismissive he could be of the fox's overwhelming presence. "I don't want to be the sage. I'm Naruto Uzumaki and I'm my own man." He frowned for a moment. "Boy, whatever." He looked up with a small chuckle as the fox lay back down with its head resting on its paws. "So creation of all things? That sounds impressive." Another grunt from the Kyuubi ensued as its eyes remained firmly closed, clearly telling Naruto to leave it be. So what else could he make? Silence reigned except for the steady if highly irritated breathing of the great kitsune. Suddenly a thought struck Naruto as his shikuju appeared in his hand, as if from thin air. Did he make this with it? At that the Kyuubi cracked open an eye to glare distastefully at the boy who only grinned victoriously. "Ah, so he did." The eye immediately closed again much to Naruto's silent amusement. "You know, what do you really stand to lose being more cooperative?" Suddenly the fox's eyes snapped open as it rose to its full height, an all too familiar and imposing grin stretched across its glistening maw. "Oh? And what do I stand to gain? My freedom?" Naruto smirked as he shot back without a moment of hesitation. "Maybe." At that the fox blinked once, the twisted grin morphing into a more irritated snarl. "Do not lie to me, Rinnegan, it debases your already pitiful race even further." Naruto sighed but never lost his confident smile, instead settling for sitting down on the warm ground. "I'm not lying. I want to free not only you, but all the bijou, preferably where you cannot harm anybody." The fox just snorted at that, settling down once again as their impromptu staring contest continued. "So that is your plan? To send us away to some far corner where we are no threat? Let the world forget about us so we can just fade away?" Naruto never backed down for a moment as he stared back defiantly. "And you would prefer to live on this way? Moving from host to host, a slave to whatever human fancy strikes your container?" The fox finally looked away, huffing irritably in contempt. "Leave, Rinnegan, your pathetic ideals are wasted on me. I am beyond your pitiful preaching." Naruto gave a small conceding nod as he stood up, just in time for Shikaku to come lumbering back with the chakra rod happily held in its enormous jaws. Naruto rubbed the construct's head much to its delight before vanishing from the seal once again. When Naruto finally opened his eyes in the real world, he took the opportunity to stretch out his back with a loud yawn, smiling as he felt his spine crack in a few places pleasantly. He looked up with that same contented smile only to notice both beds in the room were empty. He panicked before spotting the small note plastered to the door with chakra so that he would notice. He walked over, still stretching out a few sore spots like in his neck and arms before plucking the note from the wall. "Naruto, gone to hot springs brought full with me having girl time, Shizuku." Naruto smiled at the note. It didn't sound like a bad idea in his mind, so he quickly delved into the room's wardrobe and pulled out one of the complimentary robes. He shucked his robes, rolling his shoulders at how light he suddenly felt. He never did really appreciate just how much the weighted robes weighed until he took them off. He took a moment to look at himself in the mirror on the far wall, raising an eyebrow at what he saw. He had grown since leaving the temple, probably just above 5 foot now, his muscles had developed accordingly, but there was no immediate difference besides being slightly more noticeable. His hair had grown too, the loose ponytail he always kept his spiky locks in descending to the middle of his back, while two shaggy bangs had begun to form around his temples. Naruto also thought he could be imagining things, but it appeared his whisker marks had thickened ever so slightly and the area just around his eyes had darkened. In all, Naruto was rather pleased with how he had grown up over the past year. He frowned suddenly. That was right, he hadn't even fully realized almost a year had passed since he had ventured out from the temple on his pilgrimage. He sat down on the bed as he slipped on the robe, his brow furrowed slightly in thought. What had he learned in that time? He was supposed to be trying to unravel the mysteries of chakra. He knew from the offset he had not given himself an easy task, but he had expected to accomplish more in a year. He quickly shook his head. He had mastered wind and fire manipulation, discovered new things about his eyes, helped two fellow Jinchuriki and made a good friend. He had accomplished far more than he would have ever dreamed imaginable. Still, as he thought about his upcoming birthday, he could only reminisce over the previous year and how far he had actually come in his goal. Quickly though it passed as he noticed the note still in his hand. With a grin he picked himself up and walked out of the room. He made sure his shikuju was lying over his clothing to prevent anybody taking it. It was another ability he had discovered rather recently while searching for Taki. He found he could almost imbue the staff with his deva path, effectively increasing its weight tenfold or conversely decreasing it to the point he could barely feel it in his hand. He hadn't tried this yet with his preta path because he wasn't exactly sure what that would do or if it would be dangerous to those around him. He quickly walked down to the hot springs, noticing they were separated into male and female, and quickly changed into a small towel he kept tied around his waist. When he walked in he noticed he seemed to be completely alone. It was strange, but not unheard of, so he shrugged it off and lowered himself into the steaming waters. Instantly a sigh escaped his mouth as the waters began to leach the aches and worries from his body. After a while, he wasn't sure how long, but it really didn't matter by that point, his eyebrow began to visibly twitch as he lay back in the waters. A soft but highly irritating giggling kept disturbing his peaceful soak. However, when he raised his head to look around there was nobody there. He shook his head and lay back down, dismissing it as something happening on the girl's side of the onsen. They were only separated by a single wooden wall after all. However, as it continued, Naruto was more and more sure it was coming from his side of the springs. While it was high-pitched, the voice was definitely masculine, and every so often it would be accompanied by the sound of a pencil scratching against paper. Finally, having enough, Naruto got up, still with a towel wrapped around his waist. His hair was now plastered around his head, though in a damp mess without his hair tie. He walked towards the noise, still very confused, when he ended up at a portion of the wooden wall separating the two springs. He was about to dismiss it again as being on the other side when his eyes caught a faint ripple in the air that he wouldn't have noticed if he hadn't been studying the area intently. He looked at it until he was sure it was a person using some kind of jutsu, disturbingly though he couldn't see even an ounce of chakra. He waited another moment before clearing his throat. When nothing happened, he cleared his throat again. "Yeah, what do you want, Gaki?" Naruto was only mildly surprised when the jutsu finally dropped to reveal a man with long spiky white hair, tied up in a fashion similar to the way he did his own but much longer. He was wearing a red and green battle kimono and Geta sandals with a shinobi headband that simply had the kanji for oil, making his allegiances unclear. Most strange of all though was the fact he was standing atop an enormous toad who, possibly even stranger still, looked incredibly embarrassed to be there. "Don't you think it's rude to be spying on the female side of the onsen?" The white-haired man just raised an eyebrow at the small blonde boy who had a startling resemblance to his prized student. Of course he knew it was not Minato, the 3 whisker marks in each cheek disproved that. He was confused though. It couldn't be Naruto either. Last word from his sensei told him Naruto was currently in the fire temple. However, blonde hair with whiskers was not something you saw every day, and Jiraiya was not a legendary spy master for being unobservant. "It's not rude, kid. I'm giving these lovely ladies a chance to be a rare part of my research." He giggled perversely after that as a small trickle of blood leaked from the corner of his nose. He hopped down off the toad to avoid being spotted by the women on the other side. Now he was visible. Research? The man grinned broadly at that in a way Naruto found immediately uncomfortable. Ah, so you're unfamiliar with my work? Naruto just looked at him cluelessly, which was all the answer he needed before he produced a single orange book from seemingly nowhere. Here kid, you're a little young, but it might just give you the edge later on in life. He winked at the blonde before climbing back up on the toad to continue his peeping. Jiraiya-sama, please be careful with those geta. My back is not made of stone, you know. Naruto just blinked once, then twice, and then a third time as he stared at the toad that had just talked. Quiet Gamajuru, you'll give us away. Naruto continued to stare as the toad groaned in annoyance and discomfort, or croaked at least. Did your toad just talk? The man turned around again with an exasperated look which also seemed relatively amused. Of course he did, he's a summon from Myobokuzen. Suddenly the man jumped off the toad with a wild flourish, allowing the poor amphibian to dispel into smoke with a relieved croak. And that of course would make me the one and only, the great and wise, the gallant Jiraiya. A few seconds went by after the man performed his little kabuki dance with just the sound of cicadas chirping in the background as Naruto stared at the man blankly. Finally Jiraiya looked down with a hint of irritation at the young blonde who just blinked back without comprehension. You have no idea who I am, do you? Naruto just shook his head once, causing the large man to flop his torso forward almost comically with an imaginary cloud over his head. Finally he stood up as if nothing had happened, straightening his kimono top with an absent shake of his head. PFTT, kids today, don't know anything important. Anyway, run along kid, I have things to do. Naruto just shrugged, already fairly bored with the man before him. Now where did Gamajuru go? Naruto suddenly turned back around with interest as the man began running through hand seals, unknowingly showing Naruto the precise way the chakra moved for the jutsu. Kuchios no jutsu. The man slammed his hands down and a moment later the same large toad reappeared in the same cloud of smoke it had disappeared in. Naruto only watched with interest for a moment longer before turning back, deciding against returning to the spring if this pervert planned on sticking around. However, as he began to walk back he could help but notice the man precariously leaning over the edge of the divide, no doubt hoping for a better look through the steam. Naruto just couldn't help himself, he hadn't pranked anybody in far too long. Shinra Tensei. Naruto greatly toned down the technique, using only minimum chakra, however it was enough to overbalance the toad sage, tipping him over the edge and into the female side. Naruto walked back to his room grinning, the sounds of righteous feminine fury like music in his ears as he left. Naruto sat on one of the beds, full when Shizuku still had not returned from the hot springs and Masaru was sleeping in a pile of Shizuku's clothes. He was absently twirling a chakra rod in his hands, something that had become somewhat of an anxious tic recently. He was thinking about the encounter with the strange man and the things he could do. He was obviously a shinobi, yet with his strange headband Naruto couldn't be sure where from. More specifically, he was thinking about the man's invisibility jutsu and the way he summoned the toad. He believed the former worked by somehow bending light around the user, yet without seeing any hand signs he couldn't be certain. However, now the blonde knew such a thing was possible, he was certainly going to try and replicate it someday. The ability to turn completely invisible was just too useful to ignore. However, more immediately on his mind was the summoning jutsu. He had no idea exactly how it worked as none of the monks at the temple knew the technique. However, he knew it just couldn't be random as the man obviously had some kind of history with the toad, Gamajuru if he remembered right. He continued to think as he sat on the bed, it couldn't possibly be as simple as running through some hand seals and putting the right amount of chakra in, could it? Almost without even realizing, Naruto's hands began to almost instinctively run through the motions he had seen Jiraiya use. He molded his chakra in a certain way almost reflexively as a feeling he hadn't experienced in years overcame him, words suddenly imposing themselves in his mind. Animal path, Kuchios. Smoke enveloped the room, causing Naruto to cough violently into his hand as he waved the other in an attempt to clear the suffocating white smoke. When it did clear, a confused frown spread across his face. Standing there, looking rather confused himself, was Masaru. Strangely enough, the little monkey was holding onto one of his chakra rods, one of the ones he had created earlier and left in the room to see how long they lasted. Huh. It wasn't the most eloquent thing he had ever said, but it summed up the situation quite nicely. Frowning, he picked up the little capuchin and once again placed him across the room. By now the little simian had dropped the rod, so Naruto quickly created another. He tried to hand it to Masaru, but he seemed wary of the innocuous black stick, but in the end accepted it anyway, lightly nibbling on it. Naruto retreated across the room and once again ran through the hand seals before pausing at the last one. He stopped, allowing his chakra to settle before doing it again, but this time just manipulating his chakra instead of using the hand signs. He wasn't sure why, but for some reason it just felt more natural this way. Slamming his hands down, he was once again enveloped in smoke, but less this time. Just as confused as before, Masaru stood in front of him, this time quickly throwing the chakra rod across the room. Wow, this is so cool. He again moved across the room, staring intently at Masaru, who by this point was hopping up and down while chattering excitedly. He once again molded the chakra, focusing intently on the monkey, although this time it felt more difficult, like he was actually having to force it instead of it coming naturally. A third time Masaru appeared in front of him out of a veil of smoke, but it confirmed it was far more difficult. So I can summon him, but if they have one of my chakra rods it's easier. He frowned again before walking over to the monkey, quickly pushing some of his own chakra into the monkey's system. It wasn't too dangerous. As far as he could tell, the chakra between all living things besides plants was fairly similar, and his preta path automatically adjusted to the new body. He walked back and tried the summoning again, this time smirking as it once again flowed naturally, resulting in yet another instance of Masaru traveling across the room. Okay, no, it's not my chakra rods, but my chakra. I can summon anything connected with my chakra with ease. He smiled at the new discovery, and if the words that had appeared in his head were any indication, he had discovered a new path which made 3 down and 3 more to go. I wonder if I can summon anything else. He focused instead on a lamp that was across the room from him, once again molding his chakra in the correct way. However, this time it was almost as if his chakra refused to flow, making his hand stutter from the build-up before he allowed it to redisperse into his body with a small sigh. That time it had felt more exhausting than he thought possible, forcing him to sit back on the bed. The lamp hadn't budged an inch, causing the blonde to frown. Just to check, he retried it, only for the exact same results and another rush of tiredness to sweep over him. Okay, so I either can't summon objects or I don't have enough chakra to do it. Even so, it seems like an enormous waste. Even if I could get it to work, it's too tiring. Naruto spent another few minutes experimenting with his newfound ability, trying to discover everything he could about it. Quickly he managed to learn that if he implanted a chakra rod into anything, then he could then summon it. Likewise, if he pushed enough chakra into an object, he could summon that too, although it was still very exhausting. So I can summon animals and anything with my chakra in, but what about people? Curiously, he began to mold his chakra again, for some reason his thoughts instantly going to Fu. Without even thinking it through all the way, he slammed his hand down, the usual summoning matrix spreading out from his palm on the floor. He nearly fainted as the resulting smoke cleared, only to reveal a confused and very naked Fu. What happened? The mocha-skinned girl turned only to find herself in the room they were staying in, surrounded by quickly dissipating smoke. Naruto was also there, although he was turned away from her with his hand over his eyes. Gah! I'm so sorry, Fu. The mint-haired girl just blinked rapidly, wondering just what was going on. Naruto-san? How did I get here? Naruto turned slowly, still keeping his eyes covered, as Fu was still just standing there, oblivious or uncaring of her nudity. I summoned you? Fu blinked once again before a look of incredulity crossed her features. She knew about summoning and summoning contracts of course, but the possibility of one person summoning another despite the fact they were not a summoning animal and there was no contract was too much. You summon me? The blonde just nodded slowly while Fu's eyebrow only raised slightly. Can I ask why? Naruto nodded slowly again, looking far more sheepish this time. And also why you are covering your eyes like that? At that Naruto just looked at her in shock, or at least as much as he could convey with his eyes covered like that. What do you mean? You're naked. Fu just looked down, her eye quirking as if was the first time she had actually noticed. Oh, so I am. She looked up, her face completely unconcerned, not that Naruto could see that, all he could see was the vague outline of her chakra. Was there a reason you summoned me naked? At that Naruto raised a hand, waving it madly as his face flushed bright red as he began to mumble gibberish before promptly fainting, luckily onto the bed. Fu blinked again at the situation before sighing and grabbing another towel. Shizuku would probably be worried at her sudden absence. Naruto hummed pleasantly as he woke up, enjoying the warmth of the bed and the softness of the blanket. It had been a long time since he had been able to sleep on a comfortable mattress, longer still since he had a pillow as well. The warmth in front of him was also incredibly pleasant, so he pulled it a little closer to him, finding the resulting murmur of appreciation cute. He took a deep and satisfied breath, finding an earthy but not unpleasant scent invading his nose. Wait, he cracked open a single violet eye only to see a sheet of wavy green hair in front of him. That wasn't right. Suddenly the hair belonged to shifted and Naruto suddenly found himself face to face with a sleepy, but definitely awake Fu. Morning Naruto-san. The blonde just blinked, his early morning body still just a little too unresponsive to move. There was also the fact he had one arm wrapped around Fu's comfortably warm body. Fu, why are we in the same bed? The mint-haired girl simply yawned cutely into her palm, the one that wasn't trapped by Naruto's own arm. This is my bed, I didn't want to wake you Naruto-san, so I let you stay here. Naruto nodded slowly, trying to inch his body away from the girl despite her rather adamantly refusing to let his arm leave. Okay. But then why is my arm wrapped around your body? With how Fu kept responding as if it was of little concern, the situation became increasingly surreal. Naruto-san is very warm. At that Naruto simply nodded again slowly before succeeding in pulling his body out of her grip, much to her sleepy protest. He quickly jumped out of bed, sighing in relief when he found himself still wearing clothes at least. He looked down only to notice that Fu did not extend the same courtesy. Immediately his face took on a remarkable tomato-esque hue as he robotically moved away from the bed only to have Fu sit up, still completely uncaring about her indecency. Ah Fu, please put some clothes on. Fu just tilted her head innocently, a look of confusion on her face that was far too cute to be anything less than an A-ranked jutsu. As I understood it, boys enjoy seeing girls without their clothes. Was I wrong? Naruto's eyes just began to twitch violently, his blush didn't lose any of its intensity either. Ah well, yes but right now it's you see, Naruto gave a small fleeting smile, desperately trying to keep his gaze strictly on Fu's orange eyes. However, it didn't last long and he happily collapsed back on the couch with a large grin and just the faintest trickle of blood running down his nose. It was of course at that moment Shizuku woke up, sleepily rubbing her eyes with another cute yawn. She looked around, noticing Fu just now pulling on her mesh undershirt while Naruto was seemingly asleep on the couch with a strange look. Good morning Fu, what's going on? The vedette just looked at the other girl for a moment, her confused gaze flickering between her and Naruto a few times. I'm not entirely sure myself. A few days later and the ragtag group of Jinchuriki, monk, girl, and monkey were just about to cross over the border to Shimo no Kuni. Naruto had managed to get over the incident in the onsen, but he hadn't quite been able to look at Fu without a small blush for the next day. Luckily Fu didn't mention it to Shizuku, either because she understood what she did or because she didn't think it was noteworthy. Naruto honestly didn't care either way. Okay, how about a three-headed bird? Over the course of the past few days with little else to do on their journey, the group had taken to suggesting fantastical things for Naruto to try and summon. He had discovered that if he attempted to summon something which technically shouldn't exist, it would be created, in a way much like a shadow clone. The creature itself would have no real mind of its own, and Naruto could even see through its Rinnegan eyes. It also made an amusing game to see if there was something he could not summon. Obliging, Naruto slammed his hand down on the ground as they walked. Out of the cloud of smoke which he had worked on reducing flew a small feathered bird with 3 heads, all of which had Rinnegan eyes. It gave Naruto a brief headache before he dismissed it with another burst of chakra. He had wondered what happened to the creatures he created once he dismissed them, but ultimately dismissed it as more suggestions came. How about something that can warm us up? Fu made a valid point. It had started to become extremely cold the closer they got to the border. Naruto was fine as he was running fire chakra through his system, but Fu and Shizuku, despite their warm cloaks, were starting to feel it. Naruto just put a finger to his lips as he contemplated what to summon before inspiration struck. Okay, let's try this. He slammed his hand down and allowed the customary sealing matrix to spread out as the other two, and Masaru to a smaller degree, watched in anticipation. Out of the smoke crawled a small lizard. That in itself was not all that impressive. What was interesting was the creature was a dull shade of orange and had fire streaming down its back like a fin, ending with a small flame at the tip of its tail. Whoa, never thought I'd ever get summoned. He turned around to look at the 3 humans, surprising them by his lack of Rinnegan in his beady eyes. Did one of you summon me? All 3 blinked simultaneously at the small flaming lizard as Naruto put his hand up hesitantly. Yeah, I did. He shook his head and stared closer at the small lizard. Wait, you're actually real? Surprisingly, the flaming lizard looked quite indignant about that despite its tiny body and young-sounding voice. Of course I'm real. What did you expect when you summoned me? Naruto just chuckled sheepishly and rubbed the back of his head. Sorry about that, I didn't think salamanders actually existed. Well, the fire elemental salamanders, that is, not the amphibians. Somewhere far away, farther than Naruto would ever travel in his lifetime, a young pink-haired boy wearing a scaled scarf sneezed, startling his blue cat companion. Pfft, you humans, always forgetting the past. The lizard sighed deeply, an amusing sight from such a little animal. Well, if you wanna summon us again, I recommended you talk to Ka-san. She'd be angry if all her kids started vanishing suddenly when we haven't ever given out a contract. Suddenly the creature blinked, again an amusing sight for such a supposedly legendary creature. How did you summon me anyway? Naruto chuckled, waving his hand dismissively at the little flame dweller. Not really important, but as you're here, do you mind warming up my friends? The creature snorted indignantly again, exhaling a thin stream of flames that made Naruto nervous about letting it near either of the girls. What am I, a stove? Suddenly though he was lifted up into the air as Shizuku picked him up, startling the poor salamander. Surprisingly to the Miko impersonator, the flames running along his spine weren't hot, just pleasantly warm. Whoa whoa whoa, what do you think you're doing, lady? It was about to rather violently breathe fire at the person stupid enough to pick up a fire-breathing animal before it suddenly found itself staring into Shizuku's wide glittering eyes. You're so cute. If it was possible, the small lizard took on a slightly darker hue in what was equivalent to a reptile blushing. Well, I suppose this one time it couldn't hurt, hey. It was suddenly rubbed along Shizuku's cheek in a strange facsimile of a hug which only seemed to darken its embarrassed red hue. So what's your name, little guy? The salamander might have protested indignantly at that comment but was too busy being embarrassed by Shizuku to properly notice. Keikahanu. The group, now including the salamander perched rather happily on Shizuku's shoulder, carried on their way to Shimo no Kuni and soon enough had crossed the border. Like the country's name would suggest, the land of frost was incredibly cold. Snow blanketed the country in most places, tinging everything a shade of white. Shizuku was practically in awe when they reached the first village. All the roads were bathed in a pristine sheet of white while icicles seemed to hang from every overhang, glittering in the light from the lamps. Naruto too was impressed, however he didn't drop his usual expression to gawk like Shizuku did, neither did Fu, although it was for different reasons. Still, inside the green-haired girl was both wide-eyed and impressed. She had never seen snow before, it was never cold enough in Takigakure for it. Suddenly though, Naruto seemed to notice something as they walked, apart from the streets being nearly empty from the cold. Hey, it's not raining. Time seemed to freeze for a moment for Shizuku as she just stopped right there in the middle of the street. She tentatively looked up only to confirm that it was not in fact raining. In fact, it had not rained since they entered the country. What the? The Violet was looking up at the starlit sky with awe. It was so rare she was allowed to glimpse the uncovered sky she had almost forgotten how beautiful it was. Fu just looked around. She knew about Shizuku's condition. The girl had explained it to her when she had remarked about the constant downpour they seemed to be walking in before now. I suppose it is too cold. Shizuku just let out a happy squeal as she jumped about, nearly shaking Kahanu from his perch on her shoulder. I love it here. Can we stay forever? She only got two very quick headshakes from Fu and Naruto, especially from the green-haired Jinchuriki, who was currently shivering quite profoundly. Shizuku just let her head drop a little before bringing it up. Her eyes were large and watering slightly, with her lower lip jutted out in the epitome of cuteness. However, she was miffed when Fu stared her down quite evenly with one hand covering Naruto's eyes. No. Shizuku pouted again, but it had no effect against the much more stoic Fu, so they continued on. Fu, could you let go of my eyes? I might ga. Naruto suddenly found himself on the ground, slightly dazed from bumping his head against the cold and hard ground. When he opened his eyes with a small wince, he found himself looking into the rather startled face of another girl, and not one he knew. She had dark hair in a bob around her head with bangs that curved to her face but pulled into a high ponytail at the back. She also wore a headband with a strange flower-like design engraved on it. Her captivating green eyes were glaring at him viciously. You! She was suddenly on her feet, instantly in a fighting position with her arms drawn back into fists. Her eyes occasionally darted around to the two other girls looking at her strangely, but most of the time they were squarely fixed on Naruto with a savage glare. Sorry about that, I couldn't see where I was going. Naruto picked himself up sedately, using his shikuju to help, seemingly ignoring the obviously hostile kunoichi in front of him. Shut up, you have to fight me now. Naruto just blinked once with an almost amused expression as he brushed the snow from his robes. If this is about knocking into you, I'm sure we can come to something more peaceful. The kunoichi only glared at him even harder, her hand already going for her kunai pouch as Fu mirrored the action, willing to protect the boy who had saved her without question. Naruto just raised a hand letting her know to stop. The mint-haired girl was hesitant, but she reluctantly moved her hand away from the pouch on her thigh. I don't care about that, you have those eyes, so I must fight you for the honor of my village. Naruto just sighed wearily as he rubbed the bridge of his nose, trying to think of some way he could end this in the next few moments so they could find an inn or temple for the night. Look, my companions and he was suddenly cut off as, almost faster than most could see, the kunoichi launched a barrage of shuriken at him. Fu and Shizuku let out simultaneous gasps while the kunoichi had a victorious smirk. All of those died though the instant the shuriken simply stopped in the air about a foot from Naruto's face before harmlessly falling to the floor. Naruto was still tiredly rubbing his eyes, acting like it hadn't even happened. It's rude to interrupt somebody, you know. Now what's this about my eyes and your village? The kunoichi did nothing but growl slightly as she readied a kunai in her hand. Once again Naruto motioned for Fu to back away when she looked like she was about to jump in. Without warning, the kunoichi rushed forward, obviously using chakra-augmented movements as she struck out. Naruto aptly dodged to the left, straight into the path of her other fist. In one sweeping motion he ducked back to an almost impossible angle, using chakra to keep his feet planted firmly on the ground before bending back up, skirting to the side of the kunoichi. She swerved on one foot, lashing out with a fist backhand which the blonde redirected calmly before doing the same to the leg she sent flying at her. Using the newfound leverage, the older girl brought her other leg around, intent on taking Naruto's head. She might have succeeded if he hadn't suddenly ducked, letting her sail overhead to land gracefully back on her feet, still in her own taijutsu stance. Naruto just sighed as he ran a hand through his hair. He was a little tired from all those summonings. "Are you sure there is no way we can settle this without violence?" The kunoichi just shot him a murderous glare as she reeled her arm back before launching herself forward. Koha Reppuken. Naruto immediately saw the thin coat of wind chakra coating her outstretched fist. However, instead of blocking or dodging, he simply moved to one side quickly while grabbing her hand. Immediately it was drained of chakra, including the dangerous layer around her hand. The girl jumped back, looking at her hand incredulously before glaring at the young monk. "I'll take that as a no then." The young blonde ran a hand through his hair as he dodged the next few blows, actually finding her attack style rather interesting, if not slightly repetitive. He was especially intrigued with the way she coated certain areas of her body with wind chakra like her fist or feet, speaking of which. Koha Sekijiri. He swiftly moved out of the way of a vicious chakra-laced axe kick that might have split his entire body in half. The result was the girl slamming her heel into the ground, shattering it and producing a large cloud of dust. She emerged from the cloud, still sporting her enraged look while Naruto looked on, still smiling even if it was more tired than serene at this point. "Fight me back, damn it. Don't insult me." Naruto put a hand to his forehead for a moment before looking back. His eyes were serious and the smile was gone. For a moment it made the kunoichi falter. "Fine then, if it will let us leave in peace." With that he simply raised his hand palm up and surged chakra through the limb, his eyes focusing in on the kunoichi. Fuhan Shurcho. Suddenly the girl found she could not move forward. Instead she began to float in the air, suspended as if by marionette strings. She could only flail uselessly, the gravity around her being reduced to nothing with only the minuscule air resistance allowing her to twist and turn her body. "What did you do to me? Put me down right now and finish this fight." Naruto sighed as he walked forward, the jingling of his shikuju sounding strangely ominous as he approached. "That's what I'm doing." With that he gently prodded the girl with the long staff, immediately causing her body to seize up as her chakra flow simply stopped. A second later he cancelled his other technique and the girl dropped out of the air, straight into Naruto's arms before he quickly set her on the ground. "That paralysis should wear off in about 10 minutes, until then why don't you explain just what you are doing?" The kunoichi glared at him angrily as she struggled against invisible bonds, her muscles refusing her brain's signals. "Damn it, let me go." Naruto just sighed as he looked around, quickly spotting an inn that had vacancies. It would put a large dent in his Rio pouch but it would have to do. "Alright, you're coming with us. We can settle this inside where it's warmer." With that he swiftly lifted the older kunoichi onto his shoulder, setting off for the inn. It would be surprising to any passers-by to see a young boy of perhaps 11 or 12 hoisting a teenage girl a few years older than him and definitely taller, seemingly without effort. Especially considering the two girls walking behind him as if it were the most normal thing in the world. None of them noticed the single set of yellow eyes with bar-like pupils watching from the shadows of a nearby building before they disappeared in a burst of smoke. "Okay, so we'll start off with names I guess. I'm Naruto Uzumaki, that's Shizuku over there and she's Fu." He motioned to each girl as he said their names before looking at the kunoichi expectantly. Strangely, after they had gotten a room and he had set her on the bed she had become somewhat sullen, her eyes even had an air of defeat. Right now she was sitting back against the headboard with her knees drawn up against her chest, glaring at the trio half-heartedly. Naruto took the opportunity to get a better look at the girl, now that she wasn't trying to kill him. She was a few years older than him, maybe 14 or 15, and already possessed the air of a distinguished kunoichi, even if her pride seemed a little dented. She wore a tight-fitting black bodysuit that left her right arm and left shoulder bare that was tied around the middle by a lighter strip of cloth. She wore the traditional kunai pouch as well as a shoulder guard, but by far the most noticeable feature of the outfit was the window cut in the chest showing off her already impressive developing bust. Shut up. It came out as barely a whisper from behind her knees, her hair falling over her eyes despite the forehead protector. Look, if we don't talk then how are we supposed to get this whole mess straightened out? Again the kunoichi gave him a cold glare with her emerald orbs. Shut up. This time it was anything but quiet, she all but shouted it out in anger before her head dipped, tears rolling down her face as her hands trembled from where they were wrapped around her knees. I don't want this any more than you do. At that Naruto just sighed with a look of utter confusion, he was lost now. What are you talking about? The girl looked up again, tears beginning to dry as her pride took hold, preventing her from showing weakness in a situation like this, even though it was a little late. You defeated me in fair and single combat. By the laws of Nadeshiko village you are to become my husband. You could literally hear a pin drop in the room as the girl was suddenly met by 3 identical looks of shock and incredulity. What? Amazingly the cry was simultaneous as well, although this time it was only Naruto and, surprisingly, Fu. They shared a quick look between them before returning to the kunoichi currently wiping away her tears. I am supposed to become your what? The girl huffed indignantly as she cleared the last of the streaks down her face. I am affronted as much as you are, to have to marry a bearer of the accursed Rinnegan. It's the highest dishonor I could imagine. Naruto blinked at that, very nearly missing what she said in the shock over this new situation. Wait, you said something about my eyes earlier. Just what does this have to do with the Rinnegan? The girl snarled in anger as her fists tightened to the point her knuckles turned white. It has everything to do with those damn eyes. Them and the twice-cursed sage who bore them before you. Again Naruto blinked in confusion before falling back into a chair, rubbing his eyes. He was tired, damn it. This was the last thing he wanted to be dealing with. Alright, you better start at the beginning if any of this is going to make sense. The girl glared at him for his dismissive tone but nodded firmly anyway. I suppose I could do as much for my future husband. She practically ground it out through clenched teeth which elicited a rare glare from the blonde himself. Don't call me that. The kunoichi returned the stare full force until she looked away. When Naruto wanted to be he could be quite intimidating despite his lacking in stature. Very well, you should know I am Shizuka Hidohana, heir to the royal family in Nadeshiko village. We are a people of fierce warriors, trained from the moment we could walk to be the fiercest fighters in the elemental nations. We are also mostly composed of women, thanks to the sage. At Naruto's blank look where she expected some kind of guilt she sneered before continuing. The legend goes that the Nadeshiko tribe were a band of powerful mercenaries in the times of the sage. They once crossed paths and it led to the most powerful member of the tribe challenging the sage to a duel. She grimaced at that, obviously not enjoying the next part of the story. Apparently the sage refused, much like you did to me. She shot him a quick glare that went unanswered. Finally though the duel happened, only to end in the warrior's quick and humiliating defeat at the sage's hands. Again another glare sent Naruto's way. However when the sage turned his back the warrior pulled out a blade, hoping to catch the man off guard only for the sage to catch the blade in his bare hand. The blade was snapped in half and held at our warrior's neck only for the sage to discard the weapon in disgust. She looked down again. Naruto couldn't tell if she was ashamed for her ancestor or saddened by what came next. The sage was said to have placed a curse of sorts on all Nadeshiko women, that they could only ever bear daughters for the remainder of their days in hopes it would quell their bloodthirsty ways. However the tribe began to die out with no males to continue the line. Eventually a law was passed that if a Nadeshiko woman was ever beaten in fair combat the man would be taken as a husband. In this way we have managed to stay alive, it is the only way. She glared at Naruto again to which he simply sighed deeply. And that it is why it is my job as a proud Nadeshiko woman to find and destroy anybody bearing those cursed eyes. She earned glares from the two girls for that, especially Fu who since the announcement Naruto would be taken as her husband had been incredibly cold. Naruto finally raised his head from his palm, looking at Shizuka dead in the eyes, almost making her flinch from the steely violet orbs. That's the stupidest thing I have ever heard. A certain spiky white-haired pervert was joyfully giggling as he peered through a small telescope that peeked over the edge of a hot spring. Jiraiya truly loved Kuni, it was his favorite place for gathering vital research. That's right, honey, complete gold. He quietly giggled to himself before his viewing was rudely interrupted by a small poof of smoke. He blinked once before putting down the telescope and looking at the small toad that had appeared by his feet. Jiraiya-sama. The tiny toad spoke with a surprisingly deep voice which just sounded strange from a creature that small. Huh? Gamma-suppai? What are you doing here? I asked you to keep an eye on that blonde kid to look for signs he is Minato's boy. The toad nodded quickly with a look of urgency. I know, but you have a standing order with all toads to report directly to you if we run into any kunoichi from Nadeshiko village. The great toad sage paled slightly at that. He didn't have the best reputation in that village and he still had yet to settle with their leader because he lacked an apprentice, not that he planned on taking one anytime soon. Once he realized the situation though he sighed as he placed his head in his hand. No Gamma-suppai, only if the kunoichi was near me. Where did you spot her? The toad looked up proudly. He was always glad to share information with his summoner, it was his job as an infiltration toad. Shimo no Kuni. Jiraiya sighed again with a look of exasperation. And where are we now? The toad took a quick look around, used to most environments due to its extensive work spying for Jiraiya. Kuni. Suddenly it frowned as Jiraiya just nodded with irritation. And how do you plan on getting back to Shimo no Kuni to continue spying on the kid? The toad looked down ashamedly at that. I had not considered that. Jiraiya just sighed. He loved the toads, but sometimes they could be denser than an IWA shinobi. Well, I'm sure I'll run into him sooner or later, especially if it's Naruto. If he's out here I'm sure it's for a good reason. His words were full of confidence but internally was a different story. He was worried for his godson but he could hardly drop what he was doing, currently looking into Orochimaru's possible activities in the land of hot water. He gave both an external and internal sigh, wondering just what was going on if Naruto was just wandering around the elemental nations. What? How dare you mock our culture and traditions? At this point the only thing keeping Shizuka from lashing out at Naruto violently was the lingering effects of the paralysis he had used on her. That, and the fact he had previously beaten her with surprisingly little effort somewhat tempered her anger. Naruto barely looked affected by her seething rage, in fact it almost looked like he was about to fall off the seat from sleepiness. Look, all I'm saying is that I don't want this and you obviously don't want this, so why don't you just leave and pretend you never even saw me in the first place? Who would know otherwise? If anything, Shizuka looked even more indignant about that, not that Naruto believed that was possible right now with her face turning a virulent scarlet and multiple tick marks appeared at her temple. I may not want this but I am a proud kunoichi of Nadeshiko village, heir to the main line. If I don't follow and uphold our traditions then what kind of example does that set? Naruto sighed simply, running a hand through his hair as he felt his eyelids begin to droop. Shizuku and Fu weren't looking much better, none of them were exactly fresh even if Fu was hiding it better. A good one for standing up to obviously outdated and idiotic rules? Shizuka's eye merely twitched violently. Keep insulting my village's traditions and husband or not, I will make sure your head ends up on a pike somewhere. Naruto narrowed his eyes, some alertness returning. He didn't really want to fall asleep around this girl. Wow, you'll be a fine leader someday if this is how you negotiate. I'm starting to think I should have just lost so none of this would have happened. Shizuka finally seemed to agree with something the blonde said as she crossed her arms under her already impressive chest and nodded stubbornly. Yes, you would be dead and I would still have my freedom. Naruto nodded for a moment before pausing, shaking his head quickly and staring at Shizuka incredulously for a moment. Wait a second, let me get this straight. My options were win and become your very much unwilling husband, or lose and die. Shizuka just nodded, still irritated given her expression and upturned sneer. What kind of choice is that? Shizuka, always faithful to her bit, merely frowned at him. It is the greatest honor to become a Nadeshiko Kunoichi's mate. It means we acknowledge you as the stronger warrior. If you lose, it means you are simply too weak to be a warrior of any value, and you may try again in the next life. Naruto blinked once, then twice before hanging his head with an audibly irritated sigh. He had never met somebody besides Sora who could get under his skin like this. Maybe she was destined to be his wife? No, back on track. Are you even listening to yourself right now? Do you have any idea how stupidly barbaric that sounds? Of course, this only made the Kunoichi quiver in rage as her glare intensified. What about asking the guy? Or at least warning him of the consequences beforehand? Finally, Naruto saw a different emotion to anger appear on the Nadeshiko Kunoichi's face: hesitation. I was supposed to. She looked down, wincing at how feeble her own words sounded and at her own mistake. But I saw your Rinnegan and, I acted rashly. Naruto's eyes softened at the girl who looked anything but the proud Kunoichi she had been moments before. Look, maybe if we go to your village we can get all of this straightened out. The girl looked up, blinking back the single tear that had been gathering in the corner of her eye. What's stopping me from just trapping you there when we arrive? Naruto just blinked and stared at the girl with a completely deadpan expression. Once again, I believe you will become an excellent negotiator. Shizuka glared at him, but by now it was half-hearted at best. There was none of the previous venom. Where is your village anyway? This time it was Fu who spoke, although her tone was surprisingly cold and she was staring rather intently at the Nadeshiko Kunoichi, both with distrust and dislike. Shizuka just looked around, her eyes spelling only apathy for the two girls who weren't her husband-to-be. To the east, in the warmer part of the country. Naruto just ran a hand through his hair as he stood, looking out the window to see snow had begun to fall outside. Alright, we were heading towards Kaminari no Kuni anyway. I suppose we can make a small detour just so we can get this all dealt with quickly. For now though, we should get some rest. I don't think we would make the journey as we are now. Quick as a flash, despite his lethargic limbs, Naruto brought his shikuju around, lightly tapping Shizuka just above her breasts, once again freezing the girl as her chakra stopped flowing. Hey, what are you doing now? Naruto just waved her off as he collapsed backwards onto the uncomfortably small couch in the room, not noticing the slightly disappointed look on Fu's face. Insurance, to make sure you don't kidnap me during the night or something. Now get some sleep. It should wear off before we leave tomorrow. Shizuka's eye twitched again as a whole new wave of irritation overcame her. Should? Naruto shrugged lazily, his eyes already closed as he shuffled into a more uncomfortable position. I haven't quite perfected it yet. It'll be anywhere between 7 to 12 hours, tops. With that, his head dipped as he fell into a blissful sleep, his mouth sliding into a contented grin. Jiraiya was walking steadily down a small unkempt road that led to Ta no Kuni, his Geta sandals making recognizable clicks against the earth. He had a small frown on his face as he ran through the events from a few days ago, thinking about that young blonde he had run into. If that was Naruto, then what are you thinking, sensei? I was alright with letting him stay at the temple, at least he would be safe there without the hatred of the village, but just letting him wander around? What's going on? His thoughts were interrupted by a small puff of smoke which cleared to reveal possibly the smallest toad that he could summon, around the size of his thumb. Gamma Denrei. The small toad gave a short bow which looked surprisingly normal to the old sage. He was spending too much time with his summons lately. What's the word? Did you find Naruto at the temple? The tiny amphibian looked down with a small frown and Jiraiya found himself predicting what he was about to say. I'm sorry, Jiraiya-sama, I could not get into the temple. They would not admit me without your presence and I could not circumvent the barrier. I was unable to find out if Naruto was still there or not. Jiraiya just sighed thoughtfully as he handed the small toad a crumb-sized chunk of chocolate. It's alright, that seal is one of the strongest in Hai no Kuni, it would take an S-ranked shinobi to break through it at least. I can't exactly go all the way there myself though, and Gamasupai lost their trail. One of my shadow clones wouldn't make the journey either. I don't have the chakra to maintain one for that long. He grunted in irritation, fearing for his godson's safety if it really was him wandering around the nations. The more he thought about it, the more certain he was that the little whiskered Minato look-alike was the real deal. I'll have to think on this. You can go now, Gamadenryai. The toad gave a small courteous nod before disappearing into smoke, leaving a thoughtful Jiraiya to continue on the path towards Ta no Kuni, where he had heard rumors of strange activities lately. For a second time in a week, Naruto awoke with the earthy scent he was now perfectly familiar with. However, he once again couldn't find it in him to be even a little irritated at the green-haired girl contentedly snuggled in his arms. When he stirred though, Fu shifted awkwardly on the small couch to look at him with a small smile that he hadn't seen on her face before. He faltered in what he was about to say. The content, happy look on Fu's face had him at a loss as he just stared for a moment. "Good morning, Naruto-san." The blonde sighed tiredly, a small smile of his own appeared against his better judgment. "Fu, why are you sleeping next to me again?" Fu's smile didn't disappear for a moment, which made Naruto glad. Happy? He wasn't sure, but it was definitely a nice feeling. He didn't want Fu to go back to that emotionless persona she had been wearing since leaving Taki. Shizuka took up one of the beds and I allowed Shizuku to take the other. "I hope you don't mind." For once the girl actually seemed confused. Abashed? Hopeful? As much as Naruto wanted to convince himself or others otherwise, he was not actually all that good at understanding people. Sure, he could read body language and interpret motives, but finer emotions? No, a stunted social childhood saw to it that he was ill-equipped when it came to figuring people out. I sense there is something more than that. At that, Fu looked away slightly sheepishly, a hint of a blush appearing over the bridge of her nose. "Naruto-san is very warm," and she looked back up, startling Naruto with how vibrant her previously dull orange eyes had become. He hadn't really noticed before, but there was something about her eyes that just drew him in. Maybe it was because they were his favorite color, or perhaps because he saw a bit of himself in those eyes that had known so much pain. "When I slept with Naruto-san before, I did not wake up early." She missed Naruto's slight reddening at the way she phrased her words. Okay, but try not to make it a habit, okay?" He tried to appear comforting, but it came off far more awkward than he would care to admit. Fu just looked down sheepishly, yet there was something more, just a hint of happiness that Naruto hadn't completely denied her sharing his bed again. She couldn't fully explain it herself, but all she knew was that for the first time in her memorable life she had not awoken at her approved time, and that was while she had Naruto cuddling her into his warm body. Not to mention it had been one of the best and most comfortable sleeps in her life. A few hours later and the group, plus an irate but at least cooperative Shizuka, were making their way steadily down a long road that cut through the small country. It had continued to snow through the morning, so Naruto had resummoned Konoha to keep Shizuka warm. Fu was too stubborn to admit she was cold, while Shizuka was much more acclimatized to the weather despite her revealing bodysuit, which didn't look very adapted to the cold. Shizuka had expressed interest in Konoha, especially when she found out Naruto did not possess any sort of contract to summon him. However, Naruto honestly did not have much to tell her besides it was a recently discovered ability he didn't know a lot about. She had gone back to ignoring the entire group after that, preferring to hang back. Naruto still kept an eye on her though, to make sure she didn't try anything in the form of a shadow clone trailing the group from the trees to one side of the road. At some point Fu moved over to his side while Shizuku was busy chatting with the small reptile on her shoulder. "Why are we going along with this? Would it not be simpler to simply get away from Shizuka? You have already proven your capacity to defeat her." Naruto just sighed, wondering how he should phrase this, as he thought he noticed Fu inch closer to him, smiling contentedly as she was warmed by the excess fire chakra radiating from his body. "I've probably already made enemies out of both Tsunegakure and Takigakure, and as this encounter has shown us, my eyes are going to probably cause me more problems in the future." He looked back at Shizuka, who was angrily glaring at the ground as she walked, seemingly uncaring of the group save for the occasional glare sent their way. I don't need more enemies than necessary, especially when it's a group of highly trained and angry kunoichi. He shivered for a moment at that, some kind of inbuilt male instinct that warned him to be cautious of enraged females. Plus, this girl recognized my eyes almost immediately. They might have more information on the sage, like his abilities or even where some of his possessions are. He looked ahead, absently tracking a single falling snowflake, lazily drifting through the whitened sky on an almost non-existent breeze. It's an opportunity one can't afford to miss. There's too much I don't know about my eyes, information that might one day save somebody precious to me. He smiled at Fu, enjoying the slight red that permeated her chocolate skin. And what if the village is not understanding and forces you to go through with this engagement? Naruto just chuckled as he waved her concerns away with a single hand, although the doubt still niggled at the back of his mind. Ah, you know me, I'll just leave if it comes to that. We'll see if they try and stop me. Fu nodded slowly but didn't look too sure, however Naruto noticed with some amusement she didn't leave his warming aura as they walked. And there it is, Nadeshiko village. There was no mistaking the pride lacing Shizuka's voice as she pointed out the village of her birth. Naruto had to admit it was an impressive sight, built like a fortress spanning 3 forested plateaus that stood out against the flatland surrounding it. The buildings themselves looked to be very traditional with pagoda roofs and high arching bridges connecting the 3 hills. Nice. Shizuku whistled appreciatively at the sight. She thought it was beautiful, then again her opinions were slightly skewed by the indomitable good mood she had been in ever since entering the country. Shizuka just huffed indignantly. She thought her village deserved a whole lot better than just nice. Alright then, lead the way. This time it was Naruto who spoke, earning yet another glare, one of hundreds, from Shizuka before she looked away haughtily and walked on, this time leading the group. It only took another few minutes to reach the tall gate leading up to the first hill where they were met by a tall woman wearing a long skirt cut open at the front to reveal red shorts and bandaged legs. Her arms were bare while her torso and impressive bust were covered by a plain red vest held by a yellow cloth around the waist. She had stern but still decidedly feminine features with spiked back dark hair and deep red lipstick. Ah, Tokiwa-senpai. Naruto looked around at Shizuka, surprised at her suddenly submissive and small voice as she looked up at the tall and definitely unamused woman before them. The woman in question just let her steady gaze roam over the small group, lingering on Naruto with narrowed eyes for a moment. Naruto had taken the initiative to return his face to its normal serene smile, squinted eyes included, so that his Rinnegan would not be recognized. Shizuka-sama, your mother was very worried about you. It was unwise to leave the village unescorted. The previously proud and unwavering kunoichi looked down like a child being berated, which Naruto supposed she was in a way. Now who are your companions? Shizuka looked up with her mouth open but after making eye contact with the older woman her head dropped down dejectedly. The blonde is Naruto, he defeated me in combat. The woman just raised an eyebrow. Shizuka was one of the most promising up-and-coming kunoichi in the village while the boy looked to be barely 12. I see. If anything, Shizuka's head dropped even further in shame. The woman's tone was cold and indifferent but her eyes were now studying every inch of the blonde monk intently. It actually made Naruto a little uncomfortable to have such a beautiful woman stare at him with such unconcealed interest. I would very much like to hear how somebody so young defeated one of the village's most promising kunoichi. Naruto chuckled sheepishly at that while rubbing the back of his head. However, right now we should go and see your mother and tell her about this. Naruto did not particularly like the sound of that pause. Their walk through the village was uncomfortable, to say the least. Naruto couldn't help but notice that almost everybody he saw was a woman, only catching sight of the occasional man. When people saw him walking next to the heiress to the main family there were many whispers, not particularly well hidden either. To his annoyance most were about whether Shizuka had finally managed to find a husband, and of course the following whispers about him. Finally though they made it through the village, all the way to the third plateau, which seemed to be for the express purpose of housing the main family's home. It was an enormous building, towering above them with ornate pagoda-style roofs stacked on top of one another. Other than that, it just seemed to be a traditional, if not very large, wooden house with many statues and other fineries dotted about. Tokiwa made quick work guiding them through the winding corridors until they entered a darkened room, lit by candles. There wasn't much in the room in contrast to the more decadent exterior, just a few pieces of furniture and a large bed. Lying in the comfortable-looking bed was an old woman who, despite her gray hair and slight wrinkles, still possessed an elegant beauty about her that told she was incredibly striking in her youth. Naruto could immediately tell she was the leader of the village. She had the same feel about her as he remembered the Hokage having. "Ah, Shizuka, my child, I was worried about you." The girl just bowed her head lightly in respect. The blonde could tell the two did not have the ideal mother-daughter relationship. "Ka-san." The woman sighed lightly with a melancholic smile. Obviously the relationship had been strained for some time. "Must you be so formal, Shizuka?" She didn't get a response, so she turned her head to look at the rest of the assembled group, especially Naruto. Once again the blonde was made uncomfortable as her gaze roamed his body, finishing with an approving nod and a knowing smile. "And who are you, young man?" If Fu and Shizuku were annoyed at being blatantly ignored, then they didn't show it. Fu was staring at the whole scene coldly while Shizuku was admiring the various ornate pieces of furniture. He was cut off as Tokiwa placed a hand in front of his mouth, effectively silencing him. "He defeated your daughter Hisori-sama." The older woman merely raised an amused eyebrow as she looked between the two. Naruto maintained his serene air while Shizuka mumbled something unintelligible. "Is that so? I thought it would be many more years before I finally saw my daughter find a husband capable of besting her, and one so young too." At that point Naruto ducked under Tokiwa's hand, smiling politely at the leader of the village. "I think there's been some misunderstanding here. I had no idea about the rules regarding your people when I defeated Shizuka." The girl in question nodded quickly, hopeful for a way out of the engagement. "Yes, I can't marry him. He bears the Rinnegan." The entire room froze for a moment as Naruto tilted his head into a wince. He had been hoping to avoid that bit of information. Soon he found both Tokiwa and Hisori's gaze firmly on him, specifically his narrowed eyes. "Is this true?" Naruto chuckled sheepishly at the older woman as he took a step backwards, only to be blocked by Tokiwa. "Well, it isn't not true." He chuckled again, but this time more nervously, reluctantly opening his eyes to the small gasp of the village's leader. "So the legends held some truth. In all honesty, I never thought I might see the legendary Dojutsu in my lifetime." The old woman stared intently into Naruto's violet orbs for a moment before smiling in a way only older women could do. It looked harmless enough, but it promised pain should there will be gone against. "Well, no matter, the village law is clear regardless. You bested my daughter in fair and equitable combat. She is now your bride." Naruto blinked once as his hand shifted on his shikuju, frowning. "Look, I really don't have time for this. Neither I nor your daughter want any part in this marriage. It would work out much better for everybody if you were to just let us leave peacefully." Again the old woman just stared at the blonde in amusement while Tokiwa looked on impassively, although a hint of irritation at the way Naruto was speaking to her leader entered her eyes. "That almost sounds like a threat, boy." Naruto's gaze remained even, so the older woman turned to her daughter, looking at her with some interest. "Is this true, Shizuka? Do you not wish for this marriage despite what the village laws say?" Naruto sighed. Once the woman saw that her daughter was against it, they could get this mess straightened out. All eyes turned to the now quiet Shizuka, who had her head bowed with her hands clasped together in front of her. "No, Ka-san, I accept the marriage as our traditions dictate." Naruto just gawked at the girl but didn't have time to comment further as she swiftly walked out of the room, almost breaking into a run. The room was silent for a moment before Naruto made off after her, this time without being interrupted by Tokiwa. Hisori merely chuckled in her own amusement as she watched them go, smiling to herself as she was reminded of her time with Shizuka's father. Shizuka strode angrily through the village, uncaring of where she went as long as it was away from her mother. Tears were percolating at the edges of her vision, but she refused to cry, blinking them back. It was her fault, her and the damn village's traditions, and now she didn't even get the chance to change them as leader of the village. It was too late. Shizuka. The happy call nearly broke her heart. There was only one person it could belong to. Sajiri. Sure enough, it was a tall boy around her age with long brown hair tied up into a ponytail, wearing a simple brown shirt and tan pants. He rushed over, a saddened but hopeful look in his eye as he took her hand, causing Shizuka's heart to clench again. It's not true, is it, Shizuka? The rumors about you returning to the village with a boy? Shizuka wanted to say something then, to cry out that it wasn't true, to say anything, however all she could do was hang her head in defeat. That was all the boy needed to know as his grip on her hands tightened slightly. I see. He hung his head a little, enjoying the brief contact with the girl he loved while he could. I can't believe it finally happened, you succumbed to the village's rules. Shizuka looked up, the tears finally falling freely to stain her flawless skin. It's not my fault, Sajiri. If only Sajiri suddenly broke away from her, looking down at the ground while his fists trembled. If nothing, Shizuka. I love you, and I thought you loved me. The kunoichi could only stand there, tears streaming down her face even if she didn't sob out loud. We were supposed to change things, to finally break away from these rules, but now he was cut off as a third voice cut into the conversation in the form of a blonde monk running over. Hey Shizuka. Sajiri took one look at the young man approaching before glancing back to see Shizuka looking away ashamedly. He turned, staring down the shorter boy with a mix between anger and sadness. So you're the one who defeated Shizuka. Sajiri was no fool, he was a simple merchant. If this boy was able to defeat Shizuka, he could crush Sajiri with little effort. You better treat her well. And with that the older boy strode off, his fists still clenched at his sides. Naruto just looked between the crying kunoichi and the retreating merchant in confusion. Who was that? Shizuka just snarled at him angrily before running off after the boy, leaving behind a confused and slightly frustrated Naruto. This whole village is crazy. Sajiri, wait. Shizuku chased after the boy, managing to catch up to him a little ways out from the village itself. She would have caught up sooner, but she had walked slower than she should, trying to come up with something, anything to say to the boy she loved. Of course anything she might have prepared slipped away the moment Sajiri turned around, the look in his eye, of heartbreak and betrayal, it was almost too much for her to bear. Please Shizuka, I think I just need to be alone right now. Shizuka grabbed his hand as he turned, desperate for him to understand. Unfortunately, before she could say anything, a harsh and cruel laughter echoed from the surrounding trees. Instantly Shizuka was on guard, a fist drawn back as she glanced around the area, trying to pick up signs of where the voice came from. Well, looky here Marui, if it isn't one of those Nadeshiko chicks. A man dropped down from the darkness the tree canopy provided, his dark skin and cloud headband clearly marking him as a Kyumo ninja. The slash going through the symbol of the village though showed the kunoichi he had gone rogue. I think you're right, Leroy. I heard if you beat one of them they have to marry you or some shit like that. Another man dropped from the other side of the pair, this one also bearing the slashed forehead protector of Kyumogakure. His skin was lighter and he had blonde hair that ran down his back messily. It was clear the two had only recently escaped from the village. It was that, or they really were stupid enough to stay in the country that bordered Kaminari no Kuni. From the way they were leering at her, despite probably being twice her age, Shizuka hoped it was the latter. Shouldn't be too hard, after that Samui girl shot you down I would think you'd be itching for a girl by now. The dark-skinned man grinned perversely while his companion shot him an irritated look. As if, that bitch just couldn't handle me, but enough bickering. You kill the little cowering shit, I'll deal with the girl. At that Shizuka rushed forward to separate the blonde man's head from his shoulders, only to immediately leap back to deflect a kunai that would have surely killed Sajiri. Ah, you see that Marui? She's protecting her little friend. Listen up girl, maybe if you come with us quietly, we'll let the little coward go. Shizuka said nothing, just glared at the two men as she stood in front of Sajiri. The merchant was just standing there, petrified by the killing intent the two men were throwing off. Luckily Shizuka was unaffected. She's not intimidated at all, maybe we need to give her some incentive. Immediately the two men rushed at her. She was able to block the first man's attack but it was only a ploy. When the men dived back from one of her wind chakra-laced kicks, Leroy had Sajiri under one arm, kunai pointed directly at his neck. Shizuka froze, staring wide-eyed at the weapon glinting cruelly just inches from her love's jugular. No. Please let him go, I'll do anything. Marui grinned viciously, his slightly elongated canines poking out from his upper lip like a wolf that had finally made its prey submit. Now that's what we like to hear. His grin took on a more menacing vibe as he moved the kunai so it was just touching the boy's neck. If Sajiri gulped it would probably cut him. Unfortunately you still have a bit more fire than I like in a girl, I'll have to fix that. Shizuka could do nothing as the man brought the kunai up only to swing it back down in a clean arc. However everybody blinked when the kunai met nothing but air, the merchant disappearing in a puff of smoke before it could make contact. You know, I thought Shinobi had at least a shred of honor, but taking an innocent hostage and killing them just to break somebody's will? That's too far. Everybody looked around to see a young blonde with spiky hair, his eyes closed and lips turned into a humorless smile. Sajiri was standing next to him with smoke dissipating from his body as the merchant looked round, confused and a little nauseous. Hey, who the fuck are you, shrimp? Naruto just chuckled coldly as he raised a hand, quickly clenching it into a fist as the two missing nin collapsed under their own exponentially increased weight. Kenkiona Jiben. Naruto didn't let up on the extreme levels of gravity until he was absolutely sure the two men were unconscious. He sighed as he returned the area to normal, running a hand through his hair as he looked around at Shizuka and Sajiri, who looked considerably better now that the air wasn't laced with killing intent. I think we should all go back to the village. Shizuka seemed to ignore him as she rushed straight to Sajiri, practically tackling him to the floor in a crushing hug. She began to weep into his chest openly as the merchant could only lie there and take it, unable to even squirm in the girl's vice-like grip. I'm so sorry, I nearly lost you. She mumbled more words but they were muffled by Sajiri's chest. Naruto just smiled at the scene, he was incredibly confused still but it was touching all the same. Thank you Naruto. The blonde just tipped his head slightly with a smile. It's no problem. I was just in the right place at the right time anyway. He and his two companions, plus Shizuka, Sajiri, and Hisori were all standing at the gate to Nadeshiko village. Shizuka had her arm wrapped around Sajiri, she hadn't let go of him since coming back to the village. No, you helped me realize that I don't want to live my life without Sajiri. If you had never come along, I might not only have lost him, but I might never have had him in the first place. Naruto just gave a kindly smile as he looked towards Hisori a little expectantly, waiting for what she might have to say on the matter. However, the older woman just gave him a motherly smile before chuckling into her sleeve mischievously. Oh, you didn't actually expect me to make my daughter join in a loveless marriage, did you? I might have the best interests of this village at heart but I am not heartless. Anyway, you saved my daughter from a terrible fate, for that you have my village's thanks. Naruto just gave another small nod, honestly he just wanted to get away from the strange village, touching moments or not. I'm glad to help. Hisori smiled again before coughing lightly into her sleeve. Naruto was surprised she had made it out of her bed. It was clear that at one time she had been a magnificent kunoichi but right now she seemed incredibly ill and frail. I want you to have something, young monk. She reached into a pouch, withdrawing a very old-looking headband with a faded black cloth. The metal plate itself had no markings but it was done in the very traditional shinobi manner from the warring period with two horn-like spikes emerging from the metal. This used to be a sign of the greatest male warriors Nadeshiko had to offer before the sage came along. I want you to have it. Naruto just took the relic with wide eyes, it was most likely incredibly valuable. he felt as though he might break it just by touching it. "Thank you, I'm honored." He looked up with a genuine smile as he fastened the cloth around his head, mostly hidden by his unruly hair except at the front. "I know I can't speak for my predecessor's actions, but if I ever understand these eyes enough, I promise I will come back and try to undo what it was he did to your people." The elderly woman just smiled sagely as she patted the blonde on the back. "Then you have my even greater thanks." Naruto grinned as he and his companions made to leave, waving at the small group of Nadeshiko villagers as they went. The air was light as they made their way along the well-kept road. It was a warming departure. Naruto just chuckled to himself as they walked. Fu caught it and looked at him curiously. "Well, we didn't have to fight our way out in the end." Fu just nodded with a small smirk of her own appearing, if only slightly. "Yes, otherwise you might have had to marry everybody in the village." Naruto froze, paling at the thought of all those women, unknowingly dismissing a dream most men had at some point in their lives. "Hey! Don't even joke about that." Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. If you want early updates, check out Patreon. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.